Welcome to Workers Rock, a podcast that explores this truth, that we have the power to change the culture of employment across the globe. I'm Emerette Miller, the host of Workers Rock. Workers Rock is part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. All right, I'm here with Jon Schleuss. He's the international president of the News Guild CWA. How are you, Jon?
I'm really great. Thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you for coming on. Where are you located right now?
I'm at my home in Washington, D.C. today.
Great. We're both on Eastern time, which is helpful. So, here locally in Rochester, we have the Democrat Chronicle unit. And, today we're going to be talking about all of the newsrooms that you represent as the Communications Workers of America News Guild union. And you cover the entire country, correct? Is there any else besides?
Yeah, we cover the entire country. We also have some folks that we represent in Puerto Rico. And, we've got siblings north of the border, north of the United States, across Canada.
Wow. So how did you get to your presidency? How did you start? Were you a journalist? How did this happen?
Well, you got to get voted in. So I got voted in, fortunately enough for my members. But I cut my teeth in journalism, starting in student media. And then my first full-time job in journalism was at the Northwest Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I grew up in Arkansas, and so I was hired as the online editor because they were like, you're a kid who understands what Twitter is and knows how to build websites, and you also do journalism, sort of. Why don't you come work for us? So I did that for a couple of years, got my journalism degree at the same time at the University of Arkansas, landed at the Los Angeles Times where I was for 6 years.
Wow.
And at the LA Times, we unionized in 2018. And so that's how I found the union, through unionizing with my colleagues and realizing that we had so much more power together. And in 2019, so just pretty much a year later, I decided to run for the international president, and I was elected in December of 2019.
That is so cool. So it's 2024 now. We're in May here. So now since then, was that a Gannett union? I'm not familiar with the LA Times. I feel bad to say. Is it Gannett?
Well, there's hundreds and hundreds of newsrooms across the country, so it's hard. I'm probably one of the weirdos who keeps it all straight in my head, and I probably don't even keep it very straight. But the LA Times is currently owned by, I think, the richest guy in Los Angeles, Patrick Soon-Shiong. But when we organized, we were still owned by Tribune Company, which was called Tronc for a second, which was this terrible corporate name that was the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Orlando Sentinel, and a bunch of other newsrooms. And then the billionaire Patrick Soon-Shiong bought us in 2018, basically, right when we unionized. And so it's locally owned by a family.
Interesting. So you have many employers your units work for. So you've got even the New York Times, right?
Yeah.
Tell me.
Yeah, so we probably represent, our total union is about 27,000 folks. We represent mostly about 80 to 85% of our members work in media in some way. But we represent everyone from the New York Times to the Washington Post to the Wall Street Journal to the Los Angeles Times, the Seattle Times, the St. Louis paper, pretty much all these newsrooms across the country, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and then really small publications like the Casper Star Tribune in Wyoming, or the paper in Bozeman, Montana, or four different publications in Hawaii. So
right.
All different shapes and sizes, and a lot of digital only folks. ProPublica staff recently unionized with us. We represent folks at the nonprofit Houston Landing, San Antonio Report, a pretty widespread.
What's going on? Everyone is activated and energized, and across all the employers and across all the units, what's the common theme? What do journalists want, and what are they upset about? Tell me the climate out there.
Yeah, so the climate is journalists are very upset, and our union's grown by leaps and bounds in just the last I don't know, 6 or 7 years, more than 10,000 workers have unionized with us.
Wow.
From, just if you're just counting like, from newsrooms, we have more than 100 newsrooms that have unionized with us in the last 5-6 years. And I think that like there's a kind of overarching trend that's happening, and that's the loss of jobs in journalism.
Right.
We've lost more than 43,000 jobs since 2005 in newspapers alone. And so specifically at the local level, we just lost a ton of jobs. And so I think journalists like myself years ago, but journalists today are feeling very stressed about the fact that there's not a lot of job security. There aren't a lot of other options. And then the companies that own newsrooms, for the most part, are pretty terrible actors. You've got Gannett and Rochester, but we also have hedge funds like Chatham Asset Management, which owns the Miami Herald, which is unionized. We have Alden Global Capital, which owns the Chicago Tribune. Those are hedge funds that are like actively murdering local news. And so journalists are kind of at this point where it's like, what are we going to do? We got to stand up and fight back. And so that's where folks have been.
Why do you think that they get away with, like, for example, paying journalists way less? Like, journalists know what others make. They write about it all the time. They know how much percentage unions get every year. They get it. They can map it out themselves, but they suffer. They don't get these raises. Why is it that employers think they could just pay them less?
That's a great question. In Gannett, which owns the Rochester Democrat Chronicle, last year the company paid their CEO $3.9 million, while at the same time
in money or like
in
something
total
else?
compensation. So a big chunk, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Not
in
cotton
pay.
balls, right? Not
No, they
3
paid in
million
stock.
cotton balls.
Here's some stock, right? Yeah, right. $3.9 million in
money.
cotton balls. Yeah. But at the same time, we have journalists who, are in places like New Jersey or in Florida who work for Gannett, and they have to sell their blood plasma, and then they have to go to food, they're food insecure, and they have to go to food pantries to get food to feed their families. It's terrible. And, I think a lot of it is companies, really, really problematic companies, just taking advantage of the fact that journalists love what we do, right? Like telling people stories, interviewing people, holding power to account, being the voice of your community and the mirror of your community is the most righteous job that I can think that you can do. And so a lot of times we will do that and then be squeezed by these evil hedge funds and private equity groups that just don't care.
Think about it though, firemen love what they do. If the companies said, oh, you love what you do, so we're just going to pay them less because we know they love it more than any other industry. It's not like that. Journalists have families to feed and they still have to sustain. It's just out of this world. So, Democrat and Chronicle, it hits home here because we're in Rochester. I'm out of Rochester. And I was a journalist with the DNC for some time, and I understand the fight. They recently came back from a strike, but they didn't come back with a contract. Tell me where they're at today. It's now May 7th, but not to get into it to harm what's going on, but overview.
Yeah, the overview is basically, so the company that owns the Rochester Democrat Chronicle is called Gannett. Gannett has had a very aggressive focus of basically destroying and hollowing out newsrooms with a complete lack of vision for the company. And so they turn around and they attack journalists. They refuse to give them good contracts. Now that we've seen actually some opening up of Gannett for years, journalists would unionize, they'd fight for contracts, and the company would just break the law, violate the National Labor Relations Act. And so we've been pretty aggressive in filing unfair labor practice charges against the company. The federal government, the National Labor Relations Board investigates those, and they make orders and demands. And so in Palm Springs, 15 people at the Desert Sun, the company was required to send bargaining notes to the National Labor Relations Board, basically proving that they were following the law. They had to actually set up a schedule to bargain a certain amount because they were refusing to bargain with the folks there, the journalists there. So it's really been, I think, a problematic strategy for the company in losing the narrative, which is the job of Gannett really should be of fixing and building up local news and doing that by investing in journalists. So at the Democrat and Chronicle, and actually going back like to last year we had one day where 24 Gannett newsrooms went on strike for a day. We had another day earlier this year where Gannett journalists went on strike. The Palm Springs Desert Sun folks, they actually went on strike like 3 times last year, and then they went on strike again, what ended up only being a 2-day strike earlier this year to get their first contract. And then at the Democrat and Chronicle, the folks went out on strike right before the eclipse, along with the Austin American-Statesman in Texas. Right before the eclipse, which was like a very big news day, the company, paid to fly in folks to basically attempt to cover Rochester, even though they were outsiders. I mean, they spent God knows how much money, right, on buying a hotel room, which wasn't even really available during the eclipse, to just like avoid paying these workers a decent livable wage. So we went on strike for just over 2 weeks, and the folks went on strike to get a fair contract. Rochester Democrat and Chronicle staff has been like unionized and News Guild since like the beginning of the union. Like we have to go back to the 1930s, right? It's always been union. So they were fighting for a fair contract. And frankly, they were really close. But again, you've got kind of like a complete illogical behavior by the company. They've hired a bunch of lawyers who, from my view, don't seem to have a good grasp on federal law, which is wild if you're an actual lawyer. And
labor
they don't,
law, yeah.
Right. And then they basically they're paid by the company to go in and fight the journalists who would rather just be doing their jobs, like as we talked about before. So they went out on strike. They were really close, frankly, to a deal. And the company at the last minute basically came back and did all of this, what we would call regressive and bad faith bargaining. So they came back with a complete contract and they said, this is a clean contract. And it went backwards on several things that the company actually agreed on before. They went back on protecting workers from being replaced with artificial intelligence. They changed their strategy on work assignments, on layoff protections. They also legitimately went backwards on things that the company and the journalists had already signed off on. So we call these tentative agreements. Like you get like a little bit here and here and here. And then they went backwards on them, which is regressive. That's like a violation of federal law. So now the company's basically in a lot of legal jeopardy. We went back in because we were just like, we can fight from the inside. There's a ton of support for the workers in Rochester. The community has come out.
Absolutely,
and the CEO even lives in the community. He lives in the Rochester area.
Insane. And this is the one with the 3 million cotton balls, right?
Yeah, 3.9 million cotton balls.
Wow. So where are they now? Are they then still negotiating? Is this still happening right now?
They're still negotiating, and I hope that the company comes to its senses. It's done that in other places. Like we got the first contract in Palm Springs, but also in Phoenix, Arizona, the Arizona Republic staff, they got a first contract. Folks in Jacksonville, Florida recently got a first contract. So we've been able to actually get Gannett to agree, but maybe it's just this one lawyer who just totally doesn't have a grasp on labor law. I'm not totally sure, but we're still in negotiations, and the workers I think are stronger than ever. It changes you when you go out on strike, and you really get a sense for what it's like to take care of yourself and your colleagues.
Right, a lot of cohesion there. So what about other units in New York City, like in New York City, let's say the New York Times? What are some of the victories that, give you steam?
Oh, well, the New York Times is a really great one. We got a successor contract there last year, and they had a huge win. I mean, one of the biggest things that immediately comes to mind was lifting the wages of the people who were the lowest paid workers. So these are the security guards and the editorial assistants who have to work in New York City. And it was really beautiful watching, some of the highest paid employees who have been at the company for a long time go out on strike for one day at the New York Times and actually, fight for raising the wages of the lowest paid workers at the New York Times. That was a huge victory and really great. And right now we're also fighting for a first contract with the software developers at the New York Times, who separately unionized about 2 years ago.
Oh, that's wonderful. So it's just everyone. And so, like, the issues seem to be the same. Um, well, hopefully we're close at the DNC, and I say we because I'm still one of them. I still feel like I'm a part of the team. Um, so, what are your hopes? Like, what are you seeing for the future? Because, well, let's kind of go back. Is it social media? Is it the internet? Is it really that's what it is? It's affecting journalism, like Twitter and all these things that people are getting their news. Like, what is it really about?
It's a multitude of different things. In fact, actually, I just saw this study from Pew that said one of the things is that fewer and fewer people are relying on their local newspaper, which has been the case for quite some time.
Right.
And a lot of that is like due to the fact that with the advent of the internet, it sort of took away the platform for publishers, right? Like when you used to get news, like you really were limited in sources. You had radio, you had TV and the local news or the national news, and then you had your local newspaper. So you didn't have another outlet. Well,
And the Britannica, right? You had the whole wall of your
the
Encyclopedia
Britannica that we all
Britannica, and
yeah.
that's it.
And so like one of the things that changed with the advent of the internet was a lot of publishers started putting all of their content, all of their stories online for free. And then you had Google and Facebook come along, right? And Google and Facebook, which have been really helpful for the modern internet, basically became the platforms, right? Like most people use Google to search the internet, but that is like a place, that is a website controlled by a company that decides and determines what we see when we put words into that box.
Yeah.
And so like as more people went online and Google and Facebook, they came in and they basically sucked up a huge amount of the viewership. So, people would go to Google News for information, and then they could pick different outlets that they wanted to go to. So that really diffused the whole like viewership. Facebook also was like a big player in that too. And then related to that, you lost a huge chunk of revenue that newspapers depended on, which was advertising and specifically print advertising. Digital advertising is pretty much controlled by two companies, controlled just under half. That's Google, that's Facebook.
Yeah.
And then TikTok is another emergence. So it's been a challenge, I think, on that front. But then at the same time, about 15 years ago, you also had the entrance of the hedge funds. So Alden Global Capital came in and started scooping up newspapers from St. Paul, Minnesota to Denver, Colorado. And their goal was to just extract as much money as they could out of them, taking the real estate, selling it, making money, taking it out of the company, cutting the hot water in like Northern California newsrooms, not giving people like pens and notebooks to do their jobs, and then trying to extract as much money as possible out of there and leaving them as like ghost newspapers. So it's kind of a combination of platforms, the change to digital, the loss of the platform, and the financialization of news.
It's scary. It feels Orwellian. Like, we're just going to have like a singular type of news that people are going to listen to all the time. It was a wide variety of voices, right? It was a wide variety of sources at one point, thousands of journalists. Now it's less, and it's going to be even less. And then it's going to be like, okay, we don't have much to choose from anymore. Well, this is what we're hearing, and that's what we have to believe. That's a scary proposition.
Several different like journalism schools have studied this, and they've actually found that like 2 newspapers are closing every single week in the United States. And so like the job, like the cuts, the lack of voices is very real. But then Pew Research Center actually just came out with results of a survey, and they asked Americans, they said, what's the percentage of U.S. adults that think local news outlets are blank to the well-being of their local community? And 85% said either somewhat important, very important, or extremely important. So like 85% of Americans know that local media outlets are critical to the well-being of their local communities.
100%. Like Rochester here, we live and die our local news because our politics are important to us. What's happening in the school districts, what's happening in the street, poverty, jobs, nonprofits, everything. And if the DNC were to just suddenly go away, And then, like, what, we would see the news on the TV, but would they cover everything that we needed to see?
They definitely
You know?
wouldn't. And the trickle down effect from that, and there's studies on this too, is that when we lose local reporters and we lose our local newspapers, we actually end up paying for it in higher taxes because no one's covering city council or the mayor's office, and they just voted to raise their pay and fund some ridiculous new like project. And so they're going to increase taxes on local communities. Businesses will break the law more frequently and do things that harm the environment or other workers.
Right.
So we actually end up paying for losing local journalists in our communities.
Yeah, it's like journalism is a human right because it holds our feet to the fire. It keeps everyone honest. And we know that there's a watchdog out there. Without local news, people just do whatever they want to do. They dump where they want to dump. That's where we're going to end up going if we're not careful. So it's organizations like yourself that are keeping the integrity and making sure that journalists are paid well to keep the craft going.
Yeah, well, I mean, you go back to the founding of the United States of America, there were a lot of things going on, and it wasn't the most perfect system, and it still is not perfect yet. I think we're probably going to end up there maybe in another 247 years, but top of the Bill of Rights is the freedom of the press right there in the First Amendment. Like, we knew that when we were going to have people vote, they needed to know what the hell they were voting about. And the only way to do that was to support a free press in this country. So there's actually, like, I will tell a good story if I can. New York State just passed a historic law. And it basically creates a tax credit for employing local journalists. And it was recently passed like 3 weeks ago in the state budget.
Oh, yeah.
And it would basically...
I read that in the paper somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, it would actually help like pretty much every single local newspaper in the state of New York by supporting and providing a refundable tax credit for up to 12 jobs from Buffalo to Kingston to New York City if it hits the classification. So folks like the Amsterdam News, but also Rochester.
Oh, wow, that's excellent. So that helps them out too.
Oh my God, yes.
Okay. Well, what else? What did we miss?
Well, we talked a little bit about the fight, but I want to say, we recently just got first contracts at Condé Nast, and we were about to strike the Met Gala in New York City, so we didn't have to do that this week. But the folks actually at Condé Nast went on strike for one day back in January, and so far this year we've had 29 newsrooms on strike. 29 newsrooms on strike. And the one I want to highlight out of all
wait,
those...
Wait.
Yeah.
This year so far, 29? This
yeah.
2024? Wow.
Los Angeles Times went out for a one-day strike on January 19th. Then we had like 12 or so different publications of Condé Nast go out on January 23rd. We had the San Antonio Report, the New York Daily News, the Forbes, Chicago Tribune, Orlando Sentinel, the Virginia Pilot, the Way to the Desert Sun, Law 360, which is like a legal wire service and amazing legal reporting there. They went out on strike. Long Beach Post has actually been out on strike too. It's a nonprofit that unionized, and before they were even officially unionized, went out on strike. Austin American Statesman as well, and as well as Rochester. So 29, and then the one I want to highlight is actually a group that's been on strike for going on 19 months, which is the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And so we've been on strike there for 19 months. And these workers have been holding strong. They've got a strike publication called the Union Progress, unionprogress.com.
Unionprogress.com, okay.
And they are amazing. They continue to write, they continue to report, they continue to shoot photos and videos and report on their community and cover the strike. But they're really amazing. The company that owns the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is a company owned by a family and controlled by a family called the Block family, and they have been like spending millions of dollars trying to fight the journalists there for years and years and years. But we just got word that the National Labor Relations Board is going to walk into federal court and seek an injunction against them, which is one of the best tools that workers have through the legal system in the private sector in our country. So wanted to highlight the amazing folks at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Oh, amazing. So hopefully that resolves soon. That's a long time. Yeah. So how can people help?
Well, I think I typically would say subscribe to your local newsroom, but I think you should only do that first after you check with the local journalists. So, make sure that that's the right move, because obviously I don't want people to subscribe to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. You should go subscribe to the strike publication, unionprogress.com, or donate. Throw $5 if you can. Okay. Folks who want to support our family in Rochester can actually send a letter to the CEO by going to newsguild.org. That's newsguild.org/CEO. So newsguild.org/CEO. Folks can find and search for us on Twitter. We are lifting up more than 230 other Twitter accounts of News Guild folks all across the United States and Canada. And that's just twitter.com/newsguild. Facebook.com/newsguild. So there's a lot of ways to follow us, and we try to just spread as much information as we can about what journalists are facing right now.
Excellent. Oh, that's wonderful. Any last thoughts, final thoughts?
I tend to be very hopeful about, even though the industry feels like it's cratering, it was hitting a rough patch in 2007, 2008 when the whole economy was hitting a wall. But the fact that journalists are standing up and they're demanding better journalism for their communities, for all of us, gives me so much hope that I think we'll find a way out of this. And it's going to be together. It's going to be with community support, and it's going to be the journalists actually speaking up and having a say.
Sounds good to me. Well, Jon Schleuss, president of News Guild CWA, thank you for joining us on Workers Rock tonight.
Oh my God, thank you. Workers rock.
Yeah. Well, have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
All right.
That concludes this episode of Workers Rock. Thank you for listening.